In the quaint Rosewood Inn, nestled in the sleepy village of St. Mary's Hollow, a chilling murder unfolds. When Colonel Blake is found poisoned in the library, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets tied to a stolen diamond, the star of Rajasthan. As whispers of a scandalous past surface, nervous glances and hidden motives among the guests, Miss Gibbs haunted by vengeance, and Mr. Langley, driven by greed, point to a deadly conspiracy. With a half-written letter, a buried treasure, and a nighttime trap, Miss Marple exposes a truth that shocks the inn, a crime of passion and betrayal, where the past refuses to stay buried. Dive into this Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every clue counts and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Rosewood Inn. The late afternoon sun cast a mellow glow over St. Mary's Hollow, a village so tucked away in the folds of the English countryside that it seemed to exist in a time apart. Miss Jane Marple, her small, neat figure wrapped in a tweed coat, stepped down from the rattling omnibus with the careful precision of one accustomed to observing her surroundings. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, took in the Rosewood Inn, a handsome Georgian building with ivy clinging to its weathered stone walls. The inn's sign, swaying gently in the autumn breeze, promised warmth and respite, though Miss Marple sensed, with that peculiar instinct of hers, a faint undercurrent of unease beneath its charm. She had come at the insistence of her old friend, Mrs. Eleanor Bantry, whose letter had been full of enthusiasm for the inn's rustic elegance and its most intriguing assortment of guests. Eleanor, ever fond of a social puzzle, had hinted at a week of quiet gossip and good company, an invitation Miss Marple found hard to resist. With her modest suitcase in one hand and a wicker basket containing her knitting in the other, she made her way toward the inn's oak-panelled door, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the low-ceilinged hall. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, the proprietress, emerged from behind a polished counter, her stout figure bustling with the practiced efficiency of one who had run the inn for decades. Her sharp grey eyes assessed Miss Marple with a flicker of curiosity, before her face broke into a welcoming smile. "Miss Marple, is it? Room 7's ready for you, up the stairs and to the right. Mind the third step, it creaks something awful. Dinner's at 7, and we keep to time here." Miss Marple thanked her, noting the woman's brisk manner and the faint lines of strain around her mouth. As she climbed the staircase, her gaze swept the hall below, where a handful of guests lingered. A young couple, Mr. and Mrs. Langley, stood by the window, their heads bent close in whispered conversation. He was tall, with a restless energy, his hand gesturing sharply as he spoke. She, delicate and pale, seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes darting nervously. In an armchair by the fire sat a retired colonel, Reginald Blake, his weathered face half hidden behind a copy of the Times. His military bearing was unmistakable, though his hands gripping the paper trembled slightly. Nearby, a thin woman in a drab brown dress, Miss Florence Gibbs, clutched a novel with a fervour that suggested she was not reading it at all. Her eyes flitted about the room, lingering on the colonel, before dropping back to her book. Miss Marple reached her room, a cosy chamber with chintz curtains and a view of the orchard beyond. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her knitting on the bedside table, and sat for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. The inn, for all its charm, had an air of tension, like a tightly wound clock. People, she mused, are never quite what they seem in places like this. At 7, she descended for dinner, her black lace dress as unobtrusive as ever. The dining room was a handsome space, with a long mahogany table set with gleaming silver, and a chandelier casting soft light. Mrs. Henshaw presided over the meal, her voice bright but her eyes watchful. The Langleys sat opposite Miss Marple, their conversation stilted. Mrs. Langley barely touched her soup, while her husband's laughter rang a touch too loud. Colonel Blake, at the head of the table, spoke little, his responses gruff but polite. Miss Gibbs, seated beside Miss Marple, murmured vague pleasantries, her fingers twisting a napkin into knots. As the main course was served, roast lamb with rosemary, a sudden crash echoed from the kitchen. The guests started, and Mrs. Henshaw hurried out, returning moments later with a tight smile. "Just a clumsy maid with a tray," she said, but her hands smoothed her apron with unnecessary vigour. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, catching the fleeting panic on Miss Gibbs's face, and the quick glance Mr. Langley shot his wife. The Colonel, however, merely grunted and reached for his wine. The meal concluded with apple tart and coffee, and the guests dispersed to the lounge or their rooms. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting in hand, her needles clicking softly as she observed the room. Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived just before dinner, joined her, her face alight with curiosity. "Well, Jane, what do you make of this lot? Quite a mixed bag, aren't they?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Eleanor, people are always interesting, especially when they think no one's watching. There's a story here, I'm sure of it. One only needs to find the thread." Her needles paused, and her gaze drifted to the fire, but her mind was already weaving the first strands of a pattern only she could see. Chapter 2. The Body in the Library. The Rosewood Inn, so serene in the amber glow of the previous evening, was transformed by the piercing scream that shattered the morning's quiet at precisely 7:30. Miss Jane Marple, already awake and seated by her window with her knitting, paused mid-stitch, her sharp eyes narrowing. The sound had come from below, sharp and raw, carrying the unmistakable note of terror. She set her needles aside, slipped on her cardigan, and moved with surprising swiftness for a woman of her years, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the polished oak stairs as she descended. The scream had originated in the library, a cosy room off the main hall with tall bookshelves and a broad window overlooking the garden. Miss Marple reached the doorway to find Mrs. Langley, her delicate frame trembling, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to stifle another cry. Her husband, hovering behind her, looked pale but composed, his jaw tight. On the floor, sprawled awkwardly across a Persian rug, lay Colonel Reginald Blake, his face frozen in a grimace of agony. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, and a glass of brandy, its contents spilled in a dark stain, rested near his outstretched hand. A small, glinting vial, half concealed beneath the rug's fringe, caught the morning light filtering through the curtains. Miss Marple's gaze swept the scene, noting every detail. The Colonel's stiff fingers, the faint froth at the corner of his mouth, the way the rug was slightly askew, as if disturbed in haste. She stepped back as Mrs. Henshaw, the proprietress, bustled in, her face flushed with alarm. "Good heavens!" she gasped, her hands fluttering to her apron. "What's happened here?" Mrs. Langley, her voice quavering, managed to stammer. I came to fetch a book. I thought he was asleep at first, but then I saw... Oh, it's too dreadful." She swayed, and Mr. Langley caught her arm, his expression unreadable. Miss Gibbs, who had appeared silently in the doorway, clutched her shawl, her eyes darting from the body to the other guests with a nervous intensity. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, observed the gathering crowd. The inn's staff, a young maid named Polly and an elderly porter, Mr. Jenkins, hovered uncertainly, their whispers adding to the growing tension. Mrs. Bantry, arriving breathless from her room, took one look at the scene and murmured, "Jane, this is no accident, is it?" Before Miss Marple could respond, The local physician, Dr. Haydock, was summoned from the village. A lean man with a brisk manner, he knelt beside the body, his fingers probing gently. After a moment, he straightened, his face grave. "Poison," he said curtly. "Cyanide, most likely, judging by the smell and the convulsions evident in his posture. He's been dead since late last night, I'd wager, between 10 and midnight." The word poison hung in the air like a storm cloud. Mrs. Henshaw gasped, and Miss Gibbs's hand tightened on her shawl, her knuckles white. Mr. Langley's eyes flickered briefly to the vial, though he said nothing. Miss Marple, her hands folded calmly, noted the reactions, her mind already sifting through possibilities. Poison was a deliberate act, requiring both intent and opportunity. And in a small place like the Rosewood Inn, such things were never far from the surface. Within the hour, Inspector Craddock arrived with 2 constables, his youthful face set in a determined frown. Miss Marple knew him from a case in St. Mary Mead some years prior. A capable officer, but prone to hasty judgments, she thought, watching him survey the scene with an air of authority. He knelt by the body, examined the vial without touching it, and instructed a constable to secure the room. "No one leaves the inn until we've spoken to everyone," he declared, his voice carrying a note of command that brooked no argument. The guests were ushered into the dining room, where a breakfast of toast and tea sat untouched, the atmosphere too heavy for appetite. Inspector Craddock began his interviews, starting with Mrs. Langley, who sat twisting a handkerchief, her eyes red-rimmed. "I only came to the library to find something to read," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't see anything until I was right upon him." Mr. Langley, questioned next, was curt. "We were in our room by 9 last night. Didn't hear a thing. The Colonel was alive and well at dinner, wasn't he?" His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple noticed the way his fingers drummed on the table, a restless habit that betrayed unease. Miss Gibbs, when called, was visibly shaken, her thin face pale as she perched on the edge of her chair. "I was in my room all evening," she said, her voice high and strained. "I went to bed early. I don't know anything about this." Her eyes darted to the door, as if she longed to flee. Inspector Craddock pressed her, noting her nervousness, but she offered nothing further, retreating into silence. Mrs. Henshaw, bustling about with tea for the guests, was more forthcoming. "The Colonel was a regular here, you know," she told Craddock, her voice low but eager. "Came every autumn for years. Never caused trouble, though he could be sharp with people. Last night I heard him arguing with Mr. Langley in the lounge. Something about a card game. It got quite heated, but I thought nothing of it. Men and their tempers, you know." Miss Marple, sipping her tea in a corner, listened intently, her needles clicking softly in her lap. The argument was interesting, but not as compelling as Miss Gibbs' behaviour. The woman's agitation was too pronounced, her denials too quick. And then there was the vial, small, unremarkable, yet so carefully placed. Had it been dropped in haste, or left deliberately to be found? She made a mental note to ask Mrs. Henshaw about the inn's routines, particularly who had access to the library after dinner. As the morning wore on, Craddock's men searched the library, dusting for fingerprints and bagging the vial for analysis. The inspector, pacing the dining room, confided in Miss Marple, perhaps recalling her knack for insight from their previous encounter. "It's a straightforward case, Miss Marple, don't you think? Poison's a personal thing. Someone here had a grudge against the Colonel. I'm leaning toward Langley. Hot-headed fellow, and that argument last night doesn't look good for him." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. "Perhaps, Inspector, but poison is a curious choice, don't you think? It requires planning, not just temper. And cyanide, well, it's not something one finds lying about in a village inn." Her tone was gentle, but her words carried a weight that made Craddock pause. The search of the Colonel's room yielded little. A few military medals, a well-worn copy of The Art of War, and a pocketbook with a modest sum of money. No letters, no diary, nothing to suggest a motive for murder. Yet Miss Marple, watching from the sidelines, felt a prickle of certainty that the answer lay not in what was found, but in what was missing. People she knew left traces of their secrets, even in the smallest details. By noon, the village of St. Mary's Hollow was alive with whispers. Miss Marple, taking a short walk to clear her mind, passed the post office, where a knot of locals discussed the tragedy in hushed tones. "Colonel Blake," an elderly woman said, shaking her head. "He was a hard man, they say. Something about trouble in India years ago. Never quite right after that." Another voice chimed in. "Heard he crossed someone powerful once. Maybe they caught up with him." Miss Marple filed these scraps away, her mind returning to the inn's guests. Mrs. Langley's fragility seemed genuine, but there was a brittleness to it, as if she were hiding more than grief. Mr. Langley's bravado, too, felt forced, like a man playing a part. And Miss Gibbs, her nervous glances and trembling hands, suggested a secret that weighed heavily. Even Mrs. Henshaw, for all her bustling efficiency, seemed to watch her guests with an unusual intensity, as if guarding her own concerns. Back at the inn, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry for luncheon, though neither felt much like eating. The dining room was quieter now, the guests subdued under the shadow of the morning's discovery. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes bright with curiosity, leaned close. "Jane, you've got that look. You're already unravelling it, aren't you? Who do you think did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles moving steadily. "It's early yet, Eleanor, but there's a pattern here, I'm sure of it. People don't poison without reason, and reasons are never as simple as they seem. The Colonel, I think, knew something, or had something, that someone else wanted desperately." As the afternoon faded, Inspector Craddock gathered the guests once more, his expression stern. "We're waiting on the coroner's report," he said. "But this is murder, no question. I'll need full cooperation. If anyone knows anything at all, now's the time to speak." His eyes lingered on Mr. Langley, who met his gaze with a scowl. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, felt a familiar stirring. The Rosewood Inn, with its polished surfaces and hidden tensions, was like a stage where each player had a role to play. The Colonel's death was no random act. It was the climax of a story that had begun long before, perhaps in a distant place, under a different sky. She thought of the vial, the spilled brandy, the argument over cards, and she thought of Miss Gibbs, whose eyes had held not just fear, but recognition when she looked at the body. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her knitting a quiet rhythm in the stillness. "It's the little things, Eleanor," she murmured to her friend. "The way a person stands, the words they don't say. They tell you everything if you know how to listen." And with that, she picked up her needles, her mind already tracing the threads of a truth that lay just out of sight. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Past. The afternoon following Colonel Blake's grim discovery in the library was draped in a heavy quiet, as if St. Mary's Hollow itself were holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple, her small figure wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill, decided a walk through the village might offer clarity where the inn's stifling atmosphere did not. Her knitting remained in her room, for her hands, though idle, were busy with the work of her mind, piecing together the fragments of the morning's events. The Rosewood Inn, with its polished charm, was a puzzle box, and she sensed the key to its secrets lay not only within its walls, but in the whispers that drifted through the village lanes. St. Mary's Hollow was a picture of rural England, its cottages huddled beneath thatched roofs, their gardens fading into the russet hues of late September. Miss Marple walked slowly, her eyes taking in the neat hedgerows and the occasional villager who nodded politely but warily, aware of the tragedy that had befallen the inn. She made her way to the post office, a squat building with a bell that jingled as she entered. The postmistress, Mrs. Phipps, a woman with a face like a well-worn map, was sorting letters behind the counter, her hands moving with the rhythm of long habit. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Phipps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying that gentle authority that invited confidence. "A sad business at the Rosewood Inn, isn't it?" Mrs. Phipps looked up, her eyes gleaming with the eagerness of one who thrived on local gossip. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. Poor Colonel Blake poisoned, they say. Never thought I'd see such a thing here." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Mind you, he wasn't a stranger to trouble. Years ago, there was talk of a scandal in India, something about a stolen diamond, the Star of Rajasthan they called it. Worth a fortune it was. Blake was mixed up in it, though nothing was ever proved." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind quickened. "A diamond, you say? How very intriguing. And no one ever found it? Not a trace," Mrs. Phipps replied, warming to her tale. "The merchant who owned it, a Mr. Hartley, lost everything when it vanished. Some say Blake hid it, others that he sold it and lived quietly off the proceeds. He came to the inn every year, regular as clockwork, but kept to himself. Strange man, always looking over his shoulder if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Miss Gibbs' nervous demeanour at dinner the previous night. The name Hartley lingered in her mind, stirring a vague memory of a girl from St. Mary Mead, long ago, whose family had fallen into ruin after a financial misstep. "People do carry their pasts with them," she murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Phipps. She purchased a stamp she didn't need and left the post office, her steps slow but purposeful. Back at the Rosewood Inn, the atmosphere remained taut. Inspector Craddock had set up a temporary headquarters in the parlour, where he and his constables were methodically interviewing the staff. Miss Marple, slipping into the lounge, found Mrs. Henshaw polishing a brass candlestick with unnecessary vigour. The proprietress looked up, her sharp eyes softening slightly at the sight of the elderly lady. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she said, setting the candlestick down. "I can't think how such a thing could happen under my roof. The Colonel was a gentleman, even if he was a bit gruff." Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her hands folded in her lap. "You knew him well, Mrs. Henshaw. He was a regular guest, I understand." "Oh yes, for nearly 10 years, Mrs. Henshaw replied, her tone warming to the chance to talk. "Always took room 4, liked his brandy after dinner, and never missed a morning walk in the orchard. A creature of habit, you might say. But this year, there was something different about him. He seemed watchful, like he was expecting something." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite interest. "And the other guests? Did any of them take a particular interest in the Colonel?" Mrs. Henshaw hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Well, there's Miss Gibbs. She's been here a week, says she's writing a novel, but I've not seen her scribble a word. She asked about the Colonel more than once, his habits, his comings and goings. I thought it odd, but then, writers are a queer lot, aren't they?" "Indeed they are," Miss Marple agreed, her mind turning over this new piece of information. Miss Gibbs's curiosity about the Colonel suggested more than idle interest. Could she be connected to the long-ago scandal in India? The name Hartley echoed again, a thread waiting to be pulled. That evening, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry in the lounge, where a fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the panelled walls. The other guests were absent, likely retreating to their rooms under the weight of the day's events. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes bright with curiosity, poured tea from a silver pot. "Jane, you've been awfully quiet. What's going on in that head of yours? You've got that look, the one that means you're on to something." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, Eleanor, it's only that I find people so very interesting. Take Miss Gibbs, for instance. She reminds me of a young woman I knew years ago in St. Mary Mead, a Miss Florence Hartley, whose father lost his fortune in a bad investment. She had the same nervous manner, the same quick glance when she thought no one was watching. People don't change as much as they think, you know. Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows rose. Hartley? You don't think? Surely not the same family as that diamond business. It's possible, Miss Marple said, her voice soft. The past has a way of catching up, especially in a place like this, where everyone is thrown together. And then there's Mr. Langley. He's a restless sort, don't you think? The kind of man who might act first and think later. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. You think he's involved? That argument with the Colonel last night sounded fierce from what Mrs. Henshaw said. Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her basket, began to click softly. Arguments are rarely just about cards, Eleanor. They're about what lies beneath, pride, debt, or perhaps something more dangerous. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. There's a pattern here, and it's only just beginning to show itself. As they spoke, the door creaked open, and Miss Gibbs entered, her face pale and her movements hesitant. She glanced at the two women, offered a tight smile, and settled in a corner with her novel, though her eyes scarcely touched the page. Miss Marple watched her, noting the way her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl, a gesture of unease that spoke louder than words. The evening passed quietly, but the inn felt like a stage set for a drama yet to unfold. Miss Marple, retiring to her room, sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkened orchard beyond. The Colonel's death was no random act. It was the culmination of something old and deep-rooted, a grudge or a greed that had simmered for years. She thought of the diamond, the star of Rajasthan, and the whispers of a scandal that had followed Colonel Blake across continents. And she thought of Miss Gibbs, whose nervous glances held a story she was not yet ready to tell. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple's mind returned to St. Mary Mead, to the countless small dramas she had observed over the years. A village, she knew, was a microcosm of the world, and the Rosewood Inn was no different. Its guests, with their secrets and their silences, were like characters in a play, each with a part to play in the tragedy that had begun with a body in the library. She closed her eyes, her thoughts weaving a delicate web, certain that the truth, like a dropped stitch, would soon reveal itself. Chapter 4. The Missing Letter. The morning after Miss Marple's illuminating walk through St. Mary's Hollow dawned grey and damp, with a mist clinging to the orchard beyond the Rosewood Inn's windows. The atmosphere within the inn was no less heavy, the guests moving through their routines with the wariness of actors uncertain of their lines. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the dining room with a cup of tea, observed the subdued breakfast scene with her usual quiet attention. Her knitting lay untouched in her basket, for her mind was too occupied with the threads of suspicion that had begun to form a discernible pattern. Inspector Craddock, whose energy seemed undimmed by the previous day's exertions, had spent the morning poring over the Colonel's belongings, and his latest discovery had sent a ripple of tension through the inn. He entered the dining room, his notebook in hand, and addressed the gathered guests with a gravity that silenced their murmured conversations. "We found something in Colonel Blake's room," he announced, his voice carrying a note of restrained excitement. "A letter, half-written, addressed to my dear Florence. It speaks of regret and a debt long unpaid, but it's unsigned and breaks off abruptly. I'd like to know if anyone here has any knowledge of this." The name Florence hung in the air like a sudden chill. Miss Gibbs, who had been stirring her tea with excessive care, froze, her spoon clattering against the saucer. Her face, already pale, took on a waxy hue, and her eyes darted to the door as if calculating the distance to escape. Mr. Langley, seated across from his wife, frowned, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup, while Mrs. Langley's gaze dropped to her plate, her hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Henshaw, clearing dishes with her usual bustle, paused, her sharp eyes flicking from Miss Gibbs to the inspector. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted every reaction with the precision of a scientist observing a specimen. The letter, she thought, was a key, but not in the way Craddock assumed. Its contents were too vague to point directly to a motive, yet its existence suggested a connection, personal, intimate, that someone in the inn was desperate to conceal. She made a mental note to inquire about the Colonel's correspondence habits, for a man of his military precision would not leave such a letter unfinished without reason. Inspector Craddock turned his attention to Miss Gibbs, his tone firm, but not unkind. "Miss Gibbs, the letter is addressed to a Florence. That's your Christian name, I believe. Can you explain this?" Miss Gibbs's lips parted, but no sound came, at first. When she spoke, her voice was high and brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. I don't know anything about it. I never received a letter from the Colonel. I barely knew him. I told you, I was in my room all evening." Her hands twisted in her lap, and Miss Marple, watching closely, saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not just fear, but defiance. Craddock's expression hardened, though he kept his voice even. "The letter suggests otherwise, Miss Gibbs. If you're withholding something, it's best to speak now. This is a murder investigation." "I've nothing to say," she replied, rising abruptly and excusing herself with a murmured apology. As she left, her shawl caught on the chair, and she tugged it free with a jerk, her movements betraying an agitation that lingered in the room like a scent. Miss Marple turned her attention to the Langleys, who had remained silent during the exchange. Mr. Langley, his handsome features set in a scowl, was quick to deflect when Craddock questioned him. "I don't know anything about letters," he said brusquely. "The Colonel and I had a disagreement over cards, as you know, but it was nothing serious. I was in bed by 9, as I told you." His tone was confident, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to his wife as if seeking confirmation. Mrs. Langley, when pressed, offered little. "We retired early," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't hear anything unusual. I don't know why anyone would write to the Colonel about debts." Her fingers plucked at the edge of her napkin, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beneath the surface, sensed a fear that went beyond the shock of a murder. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Henshaw, who was in the kitchen overseeing the preparation of luncheon. The proprietress, her apron dusted with flour, was more than willing to talk, her indignation at the morning's events loosening her tongue. "A letter to Miss Gibbs, of all people!" she exclaimed, chopping carrots with vigour. "I wouldn't have thought the Colonel had any business with her. He was a private man, kept his own counsel. Though now I think of it, he did ask me last week if I could post a letter for him. Said it was urgent, but he never gave it to me. Perhaps it was the one they found." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. "And where was the Colonel when he mentioned this letter? In the library, perhaps?" "No, in the lounge," Mrs. Henshaw replied, pausing to wipe her hands. "He was sitting by the fire, looking troubled. I thought he might be unwell, but he waved me off, said it was just a matter he needed to settle." This small detail, seemingly trivial, settled into Miss Marple's mind like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. The Colonel, troubled and writing a letter he never finished, suggested a man confronting a past he could no longer ignore. But why address it to Florence? And why leave it incomplete? She thanked Mrs. Henshaw and returned to the lounge, where Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Jane, you've heard about this letter, I suppose," Mrs. Bantry said, pouring tea from a tray. "It's got everyone in a tizzy. Do you think Miss Gibbs is hiding something?" Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her hands folded. "People often hide things, Eleanor, even from themselves. But a letter like that, half-written, left where it could be found, it's almost as if it was meant to be seen, or perhaps it was interrupted. Her voice was soft, but her eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a mind at work. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You think someone stopped him before he could finish it?" "It's possible," Miss Marple replied, her thoughts drifting to the vial of cyanide and the spilled brandy in the library. "But we must consider the timing. The Colonel died between 10 and midnight," Dr. Haydock said. "If he was writing that letter earlier in the evening, why was it still in his room? And why address it to Miss Gibbs, unless there was a connection we've yet to uncover?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who looked weary but determined. He approached Miss Marple, perhaps sensing her quiet authority, and lowered his voice. "Miss Marple, I'd value your thoughts. This letter complicates things. It suggests a personal tie to Miss Gibbs, but she's adamant she knew nothing of it. And Langley, well, he's too quick to dismiss everything. I'm wondering if the argument over cards was more than it seemed." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Arguments, Inspector, are often a mask for deeper grievances. Mr. Langley strikes me as a man with burdens, perhaps financial, perhaps personal. But the letter, that's a different matter. It speaks of regret, of a debt. Those are powerful words, and they point to a history we don't yet understand." Craddock nodded, though his frown suggested he was not entirely convinced. "I'm having the letter sent for handwriting analysis, but that'll take time. In the meantime, I'm keeping a close eye on Miss Gibbs and Langley. One of them knows more than they're letting on." As the inspector moved off to confer with his constables, Miss Marple turned her attention to the window, where the mist had begun to lift, revealing the bare branches of the orchard. She thought of the Colonel's routines, his morning walks, his brandy, his solitary habits. And she thought of Miss Gibbs, whose nervous glances and quick denials suggested a woman caught in a web of her own making. The letter, she felt, was not just a clue, but a challenge, a piece of the puzzle that demanded to be understood. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a moment to speak with Polly, the young maid, who was polishing silver in the pantry. The girl, shy but eager to please, revealed that she had seen Mr. Langley leaving the inn late the previous night, long after he claimed to have retired. "It was near 11, miss," Polly said, her eyes wide. "He went out the back door, toward the garden. I thought it odd, but I didn't like to say anything." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning over this new information. Mr. Langley's nighttime excursion suggested he had more to hide than a mere argument over cards, and yet the letter pointed to Miss Gibbs, whose agitation grew more pronounced with each passing hour. As Miss Marple returned to her room, her thoughts circled back to the name Hartley, the diamond scandal, and the possibility that the past had come to St. Mary's Hollow to settle an old score. By evening, the inn was quiet, the guests retreating to their rooms or lingering in the lounge with strained politeness. Miss Marple, knitting by the fire, felt the weight of the unspoken, the secrets that lay just beneath the surface. "It's like a village, Eleanor," she said to Mrs. Bantry, who sat beside her. "Everyone knows a little, but no one knows everything. The truth is there, if only we can find the right thread to pull." Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm in the stillness as she waited for the next piece of the pattern to reveal itself. Chapter 5. A Nighttime Encounter. The third night at the Rosewood Inn was cloaked in an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles over a house when secrets weigh heavier than the air itself. Miss Jane Marple, unable to sleep, sat by her window in room 7, her knitting idle in her lap as she gazed out at the darkened orchard. The mist had cleared, leaving the moon to cast a pale silver light over the twisted branches, and she found herself reflecting on the threads of the mystery that had begun to weave together, the half-written letter, the whispers of a stolen diamond, and the nervous glances of Miss Gibbs. Her mind, sharp as ever, was alert to the possibility that the night might reveal what the day had concealed. It was just past midnight when a faint creak from the floorboards below drew her attention. Peering through the lace curtains, she saw a figure slip out of the inn's back door, moving with the cautious haste of one who wished to remain unseen. It was Miss Gibbs, her thin frame bundled in a dark coat, a small parcel clutched tightly in her hands. She glanced over her shoulder, her movements jerky, before hurrying toward the orchard. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her curiosity piqued. She adjusted her shawl, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding below. Moments later, another figure emerged from the same door. Mr. Langley, his tall silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. He moved with purpose, his steps quieter but no less urgent, following Miss Gibbs into the shadows of the trees. The two met beneath an ancient apple tree, their forms partially obscured by the gnarled branches. Miss Marple, with her keen eyesight, strained to catch their gestures, though their voices were too low to carry. Miss Gibbs extended the parcel and Mr. Langley took it, slipping it into his coat pocket with a quick, almost greedy motion. Their exchange was brief, marked by sharp gestures and a tension that suggested disagreement. Then, as swiftly as they had come, they parted, Miss Gibbs retreating to the inn while Mr. Langley lingered, his head bowed as if in thought. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind racing. The nighttime meeting was no coincidence. It pointed to a collaboration, or perhaps a conspiracy, between two people who had both claimed ignorance of the Colonel's affairs. The parcel intrigued her most. What could it contain, and why exchange it in the dead of night? She recalled Polly's account of Mr. Langley's late-night wanderings, and Mrs. Henshaw's mention of a spade found out of place in the orchard. The pieces were beginning to align, though the picture they formed was still shrouded in shadow. The next morning, Miss Marple descended to breakfast with her usual composure, her knitting basket tucked under her arm. The dining room was subdued, the guests eating in near silence, their eyes avoiding one another. Miss Gibbs sat alone, her novel open but unread, her fingers tracing the edge of the page with a nervous rhythm. Mr. Langley across the room was deep in conversation with his wife, his voice low and urgent. Mrs. Langley's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had spent the night in tears. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed them all, her thoughts returning to the orchard and the parcel that had changed hands under the moon's watchful gaze. After breakfast, she sought out Mrs. Henshaw, who was in the pantry counting linens. The proprietress, ever eager to share her observations, welcomed the distraction. "Miss Marple, it's a relief to see a calm face," she said, setting aside her ledger. "This business with the Colonel has everyone on edge. I can't think what's got into the guests. Miss Gibbs barely touched her food, and Mr. Langley's been snapping at poor Polly all morning." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "It's a trying time, Mrs. Henshaw. I couldn't help but wonder about the orchard. Such a lovely spot. But I heard the gardener found a spade out of place yesterday. Do you suppose someone was digging there?" Mrs. Henshaw's eyes widened, her hands pausing mid-count. "Now that you mention it, yes. Old Mr. Jenkins did say something about it. Found the spade near the apple trees, half buried in the soil, as if someone had been in a hurry. I thought it was just carelessness, but with all that's happened..." Her voice trailed off, her brow furrowing. "It's curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her tone light. "People do such odd things when they think no one's watching." She thanked Mrs. Henshaw and returned to the lounge, where Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, you've been sleuthing again, haven't you?" Mrs. Bantry said, pouring tea from a fresh pot. "I can tell by that gleam in your eye. What's happened now?" Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her needles beginning to click softly. "Oh, Eleanor, it's just a matter of noticing things. Last night, I saw something rather interesting in the orchard. A meeting between two people who have been very careful to appear unconnected. It makes one wonder what they might be hiding." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "Who was it? Not Miss Gibbs and Langley, surely?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, her silence more eloquent than words. Instead, she steered the conversation to the letter found in the Colonel's room, musing aloud about its implications. "A debt long unpaid," she said, her voice soft. "That's not a phrase one uses lightly. It suggests a wrong that's festered, perhaps for years. And the orchard, well, it's an odd place for a meeting, unless there's something to be hidden or found." As they spoke, Inspector Craddock entered, his face weary but determined. He approached Miss Marple, perhaps sensing her quiet insight, and lowered his voice. "Miss Marple, we've had no luck with the letter's handwriting yet. It's definitely the Colonel's, but it doesn't tell us much beyond what we know. I'm starting to think Miss Gibbs is our key, but she's closed up tighter than a clam. And Langley's story about being in bed by 9 doesn't hold up. Polly saw him out late, though he denies it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "People often deny what they can't explain, Inspector, but the orchard might be worth a look. If someone was digging there, they might have left more than a spade behind." Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll have my men check it this afternoon. If there's anything to find, we'll find it." He moved off to confer with his constables, leaving Miss Marple to her knitting and her thoughts. The afternoon passed in a haze of quiet tension, the guests keeping to themselves as Craddock's men combed the inn for further clues. Miss Marple, taking a turn in the garden, paused by the orchard, her eyes scanning the ground beneath the apple trees. The soil was soft, disturbed in places, though no obvious signs of digging remained. She thought of the parcel, small enough to fit in a pocket, and wondered if it held the key to the Colonel's death, or to the diamond that had haunted his past. By evening, the inn was alive with whispers, the guests' nerves frayed by the ongoing investigation. Miss Gibbs, more withdrawn than ever, avoided the lounge, while Mr. Langley's temper flared when a constable questioned him again about his whereabouts. Mrs. Langley, hovering at his side, seemed on the verge of collapse, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, drawing closer to a shape she could almost discern. As she retired to her room, she sat once more by the window, her gaze fixed on the orchard. The nighttime encounter had confirmed her suspicions. Miss Gibbs and Mr. Langley were linked, not by chance but by purpose. The parcel, the spade, the letter, all pointed to a secret that had driven someone to murder. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where the smallest actions, a glance, a hesitation, often revealed the deepest truths. "It's always the little things," she murmured, her needles clicking softly in the dark. "They tell the story, if you know where to look." Chapter 6. The Diamond Clue. The fourth day at the Rosewood Inn dawned with a restless energy, as if the very walls were impatient for the truth to emerge. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her usual window with a view of the orchard, had spent a sleepless night turning over the events of the previous evening. The clandestine meeting between Miss Gibbs and Mr. Langley, the mysterious parcel, and the disturbed soil beneath the apple trees. Her knitting lay untouched, for her mind was too occupied with the delicate threads of suspicion that were beginning to form a clearer pattern. The Colonel's death, she felt certain, was not merely a crime of passion or impulse, but the culmination of a long-buried grievance, one that had its roots in a distant scandal. The morning brought a new development that sent a fresh wave of tension through the inn. Inspector Craddock, ever diligent, had instructed his constables to search the guests' rooms, a task that yielded an unexpected find in Miss Gibbs's modest chamber. Polly, the young maid, had been tidying when she discovered a yellowed newspaper clipping tucked inside the pages of Miss Gibbs's novel. The clipping, dated some 20 years prior, detailed the theft of the Star of Rajasthan, a diamond of extraordinary value stolen from a wealthy merchant in Calcutta. Colonel Blake's name appeared as a suspect, though the article noted that no evidence had been found to charge him, and the diamond had vanished without a trace. Craddock, clutching the clipping, gathered the guests in the lounge, his expression a mix of triumph and caution. "This was found in Miss Gibbs' room," he announced, holding up the fragile paper. "It concerns a theft in India, one that involved Colonel Blake. Miss Gibbs, would you care to explain why you have this?" Miss Gibbs, seated in a corner with her hands clasped tightly, looked as if she might faint. Her lips trembled, and her eyes darted to the door before returning to Craddock. I'm researching a novel," she stammered, her voice thin. "I collect old articles for inspiration. It's nothing more than that. I didn't know the Colonel personally." Her words were defiant, but her trembling hands betrayed her, and Miss Marple, watching quietly, noted the flicker of desperation in her gaze. Craddock's frown deepened, unconvinced. "A novel, you say? Yet you asked Mrs. Henshaw about the Colonel's habits, and we found a letter addressed to you in his room. That's an odd coincidence, Miss Gibbs." "I've told you, I don't know anything about that letter," she cried, rising abruptly. "This is harassment. I'm just a guest here." She fled the room, her shawl trailing behind her, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Miss Marple, sipping tea in her corner, observed the other guests. Mr. Langley's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the floor, while Mrs. Langley's hands twisted her handkerchief into knots, her face pale with anxiety. Mrs. Henshaw, hovering near the door, looked troubled, as if the clipping had stirred some memory she preferred to forget. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and Miss Marple felt the weight of a truth drawing closer. Later that afternoon, she joined Mrs. Bantry for tea in the inn's small conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with potted ferns and the scent of damp earth. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes bright with curiosity, could barely contain her excitement. "Jane, that clipping! It's the key, isn't it? The diamond, the Colonel, Miss Gibbs. It all fits together, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady counterpoint to her friend's enthusiasm. "It's certainly suggestive, Eleanor. Suppose the Star of Rajasthan was never recovered. Suppose someone here believes Colonel Blake had it all these years. A diamond like that, well, it's enough to tempt even the most honest heart." Mrs. Bantry gasped, leaning forward. "You think someone killed him for it? Miss Gibbs, perhaps? She's been acting like a frightened mouse ever since the body was found." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her voice remained measured. "People are rarely what they seem, Eleanor. Miss Gibbs is nervous, yes, but nervousness can come from guilt or fear, or both. And then there's Mr. Langley. He's a man under pressure, I think, the sort who might see a diamond as a way out of trouble." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft sob from the hallway. Miss Marple, ever alert, rose and peered through the conservatory door to see Mrs. Langley standing alone, her face buried in her hands. The young woman's shoulders shook, and Miss Marple, with her gentle instinct for comforting the distressed, approached her. "My dear," she said softly, "you seem terribly upset. Is there anything I can do?" Mrs. Langley started, her eyes wide with panic, but Miss Marple's kind expression seemed to steady her. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's just everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This dreadful place, the murder, and now all this talk of diamonds. We only came for a quiet holiday, but it's all gone wrong. Henry, Mr. Langley, he's in trouble, you see. Debts. He thought we could start fresh, but now—" She trailed off, her words dissolving into another sob. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. "Debts can be a heavy burden," she said gently, "but sometimes talking about them helps. Did Mr. Langley know the Colonel before this visit?" Mrs. Langley shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. "No, never. It was just that silly argument over cards. Henry's temper gets the better of him sometimes, but he couldn't." She stopped, as if afraid to say more, and excused herself, hurrying toward her room. Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Bantry, her thoughts turning over this new piece of the puzzle. Mr. Langley's debts suggested a motive, one that might connect to the diamond and the nighttime meeting in the orchard. She recalled the parcel Miss Gibbs had handed him, small but significant, and wondered if it held something more valuable than money. The Star of Rajasthan, if it existed, would be a prize worth killing for. But the question remained, who had known of its existence, and who had acted on that knowledge? That evening, as the guests gathered for a subdued dinner, Inspector Craddock shared his latest findings. The vial found in the library had been confirmed to contain cyanide, and traces of the poison were found in the Colonel's brandy glass, suggesting it had been administered during his evening drink. "Someone had access to that glass," Craddock said, his eyes sweeping the table. "Someone who knew his habits and had the opportunity to act." Miss Gibbs, picking at her food, kept her gaze down, while Mr. Langley's scowl deepened. Mrs. Henshaw, serving the meal, chimed in with a nervous laugh. "The Colonel always had his brandy in the library after dinner. Anyone could have seen him there. It's no secret." Miss Marple, her expression serene, noted the proprietress's quick response. Mrs. Henshaw's knowledge of the Colonel's routines was unsurprising, but her eagerness to point out the ease of access was curious. Was she deflecting suspicion, or simply stating a fact? The web of connections, Miss Gibbs, the Langleys, the diamond, was growing more intricate, and Miss Marple felt the truth was close, like a shadow just out of reach. After dinner, she lingered in the lounge, her knitting a pretext for observation. Mr. Langley, pacing by the fire, seemed restless, his hands thrust into his pockets as if guarding something. Miss Gibbs, reading in her corner, was a study in tension, her fingers gripping her book like a lifeline. Mrs. Langley, absent from the lounge, had retired early, her absence a silent testimony to her distress. As Miss Marple prepared to retire, she paused by the library door, now locked and guarded by a constable. The room held the key to the murder, she was certain, not just in the vial or the brandy glass, but in the moment of decision that had led to the Colonel's death. She thought of the clipping, the letter, the orchard, and the parcel, each a piece of a puzzle that pointed to a past unresolved and a greed unfulfilled. Climbing the stairs to her room, she murmured to herself, "It's always the same, isn't it? A village, an inn, a secret. They're all connected by the human heart. And the heart, poor thing, is so very predictable." Her needles, tucked into her basket, would wait for another day, but her mind was already spinning the next thread, ready to unravel the truth that lay hidden in the shadows of the Rosewood Inn. Chapter 7. The Trap is Set. The fifth morning at the Rosewood Inn was marked by a restless undercurrent, as if the very air anticipated a reckoning. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual spot by the window overlooking the orchard, had spent the previous night piecing together the fragments of the mystery, the half-written letter to Florence, the newspaper clipping about the Star of Rajasthan, the nighttime meeting between Miss Gibbs and Mr. Langley, and the disturbed soil beneath the apple trees. Her knitting, a constant companion, lay idle, for her mind was too engaged with the delicate task of weaving these threads into a coherent pattern. The Colonel's murder, she was certain, was not a random act, but the climax of a drama rooted in greed, betrayal, and a long-festered grudge. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of St. Mary Mead, told her that the truth was close, but it required a nudge to emerge fully. People, she knew, revealed their secrets most readily when they felt the net closing around them. With this in mind, she sought out Inspector Craddock after breakfast, finding him in the parlour, where he was reviewing notes with a weary but determined air. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but carrying that quiet authority that commanded attention, "I wonder if you might consider a small experiment. The orchard, you see, seems to hold some significance. Polly's mention of the spade, and Mr. Jenkins's discovery of disturbed soil. If you were to announce a search of that area, claiming new evidence has come to light, it might prompt certain reactions." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her suggestion. "You think someone will tip their hand, Miss Marple? It's worth a try. I'll make the announcement at luncheon and have my men ready to watch the guests." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "People are rarely as clever as they think, Inspector. A little pressure, and they betray themselves." By noon, the dining room was filled with a tense anticipation as Craddock addressed the assembled guests. The Langleys sat together, their faces drawn. Miss Gibbs, her hands clasped tightly, stared at her plate, and Mrs. Henshaw, hovering with a tray of sandwiches, watched with her usual sharp-eyed intensity. "We've received information suggesting evidence may be hidden in the orchard," Craddock said, his voice firm. "This afternoon, my men will conduct a thorough search. If anyone has anything to share before we begin, now is the time." The effect was immediate. Miss Gibbs's fork clattered to her plate, her face draining of colour. Mr. Langley's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to his wife, who seemed to shrink further into her chair. Mrs. Henshaw's lips pursed, but she said nothing, busying herself with clearing dishes. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted each reaction with the precision of a watchmaker, her mind cataloguing the subtle signs of guilt and fear. The afternoon passed in a haze of quiet tension, with the guests confined to the inn, while Craddock's constables prepared for the search. Miss Marple, taking a turn in the garden to clear her thoughts, lingered near the orchard, her eyes scanning the ground for signs of disturbance. The soil beneath the apple trees was soft, with faint marks that suggested recent activity, though nothing overt remained. She thought of the parcel exchanged in the moonlight, small enough to conceal something valuable, perhaps even a diamond like the Star of Rajasthan. Her mind returned to Miss Gibbs' nervous defiance and Mr. Langley's restless energy, each a piece of the puzzle that was nearing completion. As evening approached, Miss Marple positioned herself in the darkened parlour, a vantage point that offered a clear view of the back door and the path to the orchard. Her knitting lay abandoned, for she sensed the moment of truth was at hand. Just after 10, as the inn settled into a restless quiet, she saw a figure slip out the back door. Miss Gibbs, her coat pulled tight, a spade clutched in her trembling hands. She moved swiftly toward the apple trees, her movements furtive but determined. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her eyes fixed on the scene. Moments later, another figure emerged. Mr. Langley, his tall frame unmistakable, following Miss Gibbs with a stealth that belied his usual bravado. The two converged beneath the same apple tree where they had met the previous night, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyesight, saw Miss Gibbs kneel, her spade digging into the soft earth. Mr. Langley hovered close, his posture tense, as if ready to act. Sensing the moment was ripe, Miss Marple slipped quietly from the parlour and alerted Inspector Craddock, who was stationed nearby with 2 constables. "Now, Inspector," she whispered, her voice calm but urgent. "They're in the orchard." Craddock, swift and decisive, led his men to the scene, their lanterns casting stark beams across the darkened trees. "Miss Gibbs, Mr. Langley, step back," he called, his voice cutting through the night. Miss Gibbs gasped, dropping the spade, while Mr. Langley froze, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The constables moved in, and within moments they unearthed a small metal box, its surface tarnished but intact, buried shallowly beneath the tree. Craddock opened the box, revealing a single, glittering stone that caught, the lantern light with a fire that could only belong to the Star of Rajasthan. A murmur of awe rippled through the group, but Miss Marple's eyes remained on the culprits. Miss Gibbs's face crumpled, her defiance giving way to despair, while Mr. Langley's expression hardened, his eyes darting as if seeking an escape. "Care to explain this?" Craddock demanded, holding up the diamond. Miss Gibbs shook her head, her voice a whisper. "It's not what you think. I didn't mean for any of this." Mr. Langley, however, remained silent, his silence more damning than words. Back in the inn's dining room, the guests were summoned, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity. Craddock, with the diamond box on the table before him, recounted the night's events, his tone grim. This diamond, the Star of Rajasthan, was stolen 20 years ago in Calcutta. Colonel Blake was suspected, but no proof was found, until now. It seems someone knew he had it and was willing to kill to get it. Miss Marple, seated quietly with Mrs. Bantry, watched the reactions unfold. Mrs. Langley, trembling, clung to her husband's arm, while Mrs. Henshaw's sharp eyes widened with astonishment. Miss Gibbs, now seated under the watchful eye of a constable, seemed to shrink into herself, her hands twisting in her lap. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "Your idea about the orchard paid off, Miss Marple, but I'm still not clear on how they're connected, Gibbs and Langley. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. "It's a matter of motive, Inspector. Miss Gibbs, I suspect, had a personal reason to confront the Colonel, perhaps tied to the past, to the name Hartley and the ruin of her family. Mr. Langley, on the other hand, is a man driven by desperation, likely debts, as his wife hinted. The diamond was their common goal, but their methods differed. One acted out of vengeance, the other out of greed." Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We'll get the full story in time, but this diamond is the key. Whoever poisoned the Colonel wanted it, and they were willing to kill for it." As the constables led Miss Gibbs and Mr. Langley away for further questioning, Miss Marple remained in the dining room, her mind still turning over the details. The diamond, glittering on the table, was a symbol of a past that had refused to stay buried. She thought of the letter, the clipping, the nighttime meeting, all signs of a plan that had unravelled under the pressure of her quiet observation. Mrs. Bantry, sitting beside her, shook her head in wonder. "Jane, you're a marvel. How did you know they'd go to the orchard tonight?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle but sharp. "Oh, Eleanor, it's just a matter of understanding people. They think they can hide their secrets, but they always leave a trace. A spade out of place, a glance too quick. The orchard was their undoing, because they couldn't resist the lure of what was buried there." As the inn settled into a fitful calm, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles moving with a steady rhythm. The trap had been set, and the truth was emerging, but she knew the final piece of the puzzle, the confession that would tie it all together, was yet to come. In the quiet of the Rosewood Inn, the stage was set for the last act, and she was ready to see it played out. Chapter 8. The Truth Unravelled. The morning after the dramatic discovery in the orchard, the Rosewood Inn seemed to exhale, as if the unearthing of the Star of Rajasthan had loosened the grip of secrets that had choked its halls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the dining room with a cup of tea, observed the subdued gathering of guests with her usual quiet vigilance. Her knitting, a familiar prop, rested in her basket, for her mind was fully occupied with the final threads of the mystery that had begun with a body in the library. The diamond, now locked away under Inspector Craddock's watchful eye, was the key. but it was the human motives, greed, vengeance, and desperation that had woven the tragedy together. Inspector Craddock, his face lined with the fatigue of a long investigation, had called the guests together for a final reckoning. The dining room, with its polished mahogany table and flickering chandelier, felt like a stage set for the denouement of a play. Mrs. Henshaw stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly, her sharp eyes darting from face to face. Mrs. Langley, pale and fragile, sat close to her husband, whose usual bravado had given way to a sullen silence. Miss Gibbs, flanked by a constable, looked diminished, her nervous energy replaced by a weary resignation. Mrs. Bantry, seated beside Miss Marple, leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. Craddock cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "We've pieced together the events that led to Colonel Blake's death," he began, his gaze sweeping the room. "The Star of Rajasthan, stolen 20 years ago in Calcutta, was the motive behind this murder. Colonel Blake, suspected but never charged, had kept the diamond hidden all these years, and someone in this room knew it and was willing to kill to claim it." He turned to Miss Gibbs, whose hands twisted in her lap. "Miss Gibbs, or should I say Miss Florence Hartley, your connection to the Colonel goes back to that theft. Your father, the merchant who owned the Star of Rajasthan, lost everything when it was stolen. You tracked Colonel Blake to the Rosewood Inn, didn't you? Intent on confronting him." Miss Gibbs, Florence Hartley, lifted her head, her eyes glistening but defiant. "Yes," she admitted, her voice low but clear. "My father died a broken man because of that diamond. I spent years searching for Blake, certain he had it. I came here under a false name, posing as a writer to watch him, to find proof. I confronted him that night in the library, after dinner. I demanded he return what he stole." The room was silent, every ear straining to catch her words. Miss Marple, her expression serene, nodded slightly, as if confirming a suspicion long held. "And what happened then?" Craddock pressed, his tone firm but not unkind. Florence's voice trembled, but she continued. "He laughed at me, laughed, said the diamond was long gone, that I was chasing ghosts. I lost my temper. There was a vial on the table, cyanide. I think he used it for some old military habit, cleaning medals or some such nonsense. I didn't plan it, I swear. I poured it into his brandy when he turned away, just to scare him, to make him confess. But he drank it before I could stop him." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he turned to Mr. Langley, whose silence had grown more pronounced. "And you, Mr. Langley? You were seen in the orchard with Miss Hartley last night, digging up the diamond. Care to explain your part in this?" Mr. Langley's jaw tightened, but he met Craddock's gaze with a flicker of defiance. "I didn't kill anyone," he said, his voice low and rough. "I overheard Florence, Miss Hartley, talking about the diamond. I knew about her questions, her interest in Blake. My wife and we're in debt, badly. I saw a chance to get out, to start over. I followed her that night, saw her confront Blake, but I didn't know about the poison until later. When she told me she knew where the diamond was hidden, in the orchard, where Blake had buried it years ago, I forced her to show me. I thought we could sell it, clear my debts." Mrs. Langley gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Henry, you didn't. You promised we'd leave this place." Mr. Langley's face softened, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry, Alice. I thought it was our only way out." Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "So, Miss Hartley poisoned the Colonel in a moment of rage, and you, Mr. Langley, saw an opportunity to profit from her knowledge. The parcel you exchanged in the orchard. Was that a ruse to keep her in line?" Florence lifted her head, her voice bitter. "He threatened to expose me if I didn't help him find the diamond. I gave him a fake parcel that first night, hoping to buy time, but he kept pressing. I had to show him the real hiding place last night, or he'd have gone to you." Miss Marple, listening quietly, felt the final pieces of the puzzle fall into place. Florence Hartley's vengeance, born of a family's ruin, had driven her to a desperate act, while Mr. Langley's greed had entangled him in her crime. The letter, the clipping, the nighttime meetings, all were threads in a tapestry of human frailty, woven together by the lure of a diamond that had destroyed lives long before it was unearthed. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his voice low with respect. "Miss Marple, your suggestion about the orchard search was the key to breaking this open. Without it, we might not have caught them in the act. How did you know?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that grounded her thoughts. "Oh, Inspector, it's simply a matter of watching people." Miss Hartley's nervousness was not just guilt, but fear of being discovered, and Mr. Langley's restlessness spoke of a man driven by desperation. The orchard was the logical place for a secret to be hidden, especially after Polly's mention of the spade. People, you see, are so predictable when they think they're clever. Mrs. Bantry, sitting beside her, shook her head in wonder. "Jane, you're a marvel. I'd never have seen it. The way you put it all together like one of your knitting patterns." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle but sharp. "It's no different from a village, Eleanor. People carry their secrets, but they leave traces. A glance, a word, a spade out of place. You only need to notice." As the constables led Florence Hartley and Mr. Langley away, the dining room fell silent, the weight of the truth settling over the remaining guests. Mrs. Langley, sobbing quietly, was escorted to her room by Mrs. Henshaw, whose practical nature seemed shaken by the revelations. The star of Rajasthan, now evidence in a murder case, would be returned to its rightful heirs, if any could be found, but its glitter held no allure for Miss Marple. It was a symbol of human weakness, nothing more. As the inn began to empty, Miss Marple lingered, her tea growing cold. The Rosewood Inn, with its polished surfaces and hidden tensions, had been a stage for a tragedy as old as time, played out by characters whose motives were as familiar to her as the lanes of St. Mary Mead. She thought of Florence Hartley, driven by a past that had consumed her, and Mr. Langley, whose greed had blinded him to the consequences of his actions, and she thought of Colonel Blake, whose own secrets had followed him to his grave. Mrs. Bantry, gathering her things, paused beside her friend. "Jane, you've done it again. How do you manage it, seeing through people like that?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, my dear, it's just a matter of listening to the little things. People think they can hide their natures, but in a place like this, everything comes to light." As she rose to pack her bags, the Rosewood Inn seemed to settle back into its quiet charm, as if the shadows of the past 5 days had been swept away. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, like her knitting, was always there, waiting for someone to pick up the threads and weave them into order.